Felipe Fernandez-Armesto is one of the world's best-known historians. We're incredibly lucky that have engaged him as a speaker. His knowledge of world history is encyclopedic, and we're very lucky that he's going to be able to talk to us about a topic as broad as empires. So over to you, Felipe. Can I just mention, before he starts further, that questions, of course, are welcome. And we invite everybody, please, to submit their questions in the chat function addressed to everybody, where, as moderator, I will put them to Felipe when he's finished his talk.
Well,
so, thank you. Over to you, Felipe.
Very grateful for those kind words, Alan. You made me sound interesting, which is something my wife and children and students would have said was impossible. So I congratulate you on that, and thank you very much for having me to talk to the Royal Asiatic Society of Beijing. It's a great treat, to be able to visit Beijing, albeit remotely, because whenever I've had an invitation to go to China to give a talk, I've never been able to fit it into my schedule. So many thanks to you and to the Society and to Melinda and everybody who's worked on the technical side of today's talk. Although I'm very pleased to be doing this, I have to confess to two sources of anxiety. The first is friends of mine who have lectured in China have told me that Chinese audiences are so respectful that they don't laugh at one's jokes and they don't like to ask difficult questions. So I hope that those forms of politeness will be suspended today, because I don't think there's any education without entertainment, and I don't think there's any progress without disagreement. But my second source of anxiety is really I'm not sure that I know enough about today's subject. Alan and everybody else who's had the benefit or disadvantage of an English education will know that in England, where I went to school, you're always taught to start a lecture with self-exculpatory and self-deprecatory remarks. You probably know the story of the student who did his doctoral work in Oxford and who, on returning to his native Germany, began a lecture by saying, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that I really know very little about today's subject," whereupon the audience got up and left. So if anybody wants to do the same today, now is the moment. Because what I want to do is to explore the nature of empires, or the states that we commonly call or have called empires. And then I want to try and relate what we know about empires to two cases of states that we don't normally nowadays classify as imperial. That's China and the United States. And I hope that by considering their histories and their current trajectories in relation to those of states we've historically called empires, we might be able to gain some insights into how their future relationship might develop. So I'm pretty confident that I know a fair amount about empires. I spent a lot of my life studying the history of empires comparatively. And I know a bit about the United States because I live and work there, and I've written a book or two about it. But especially talking to the Royal Asiatic Society of Beijing, I'm not nearly so confident that I know enough about China, of which my knowledge is really very general. So I'd just like to kind of explain my credentials for talking about China such as they are. In a way, they go back a very long way. They go back to the image that's on screen now. I hope everybody can see it. When I was a little boy, living in a household of journalists, the house was full of books. There wasn't much about China except for C.P. Fitzgerald's short cultural history of China, which I read at a precocious age. But in the household, we did receive this magazine, China Reconstructs. I don't know how it got into the household, but the thing would arrive on the doormat periodically. I presume it was a gift from the Chinese embassy or possibly from the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding or something like that. But it became my childhood window into China. And a very strange kind of window it was, because anybody old enough like me to remember this magazine will know that it was an organ of Maoist propaganda for the English-speaking world. But as an organ of propaganda, it was singularly ineffective and unconvincing, partly because the propaganda was so blatant that it was difficult for anybody with any critical intelligence to accept it. And partly because some of it was risible. I mean, I can still remember, I'm quoting from childhood memory now, so I might not be completely accurate, but I can still remember lines of poetry allegedly, attributed to steel workers in Liaoning province, which read something like, the reddest of all flowers is the azalea. The greenest of all trees is the long-lived pine. Steel workers in Liaoning province love best Chairman Mao. There was also, I remember, a song called the Night Soil Collectors Are Coming Down the Mountain, which seemed to me to be like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. And indeed, I think it was satirized at an entertainment sort of in-house review by staff members of the British Embassy in Peking in 1981. So this magazine presented a picture of China, which was very, to me as a very young person, very bizarre and really kind of unintelligible. But it did teach me, I suppose, two things. One was that you can sucker people with rubbish pretty easily. We see plenty of evidence of that nowadays in our own world with woke drivel and truth social. There doesn't seem to be anything so silly that it can't engage the commitment of quite a lot of people. The other thing that trying to reconstruct taught me was, particularly in conjunction with reading Fitzgerald's short cultural history of China, that China was a very interesting and complex place. And I suppose that's why I went on from there to read everything I could find about China. And especially, I encountered the works of Joseph Needham and their brilliance and their range, even when they were wrong. Needham's volumes left me with two convictions. One was that the world is a suitable unit of study, and that conviction has really animated all my work. And the other was that China has been preeminent historically in the exercise of what I call initiative, that is to say, the power of some cultures to influence others. That's led me to my view that to be led by China is the sort of default state of the world, and therefore probably its destiny. And that in turn accounts, I suppose, for why my work's been so popular in China and why I'm privileged to have so many readers there. But when I say that I want to consider China and the United States in relation to the history of empires, I'm afraid that some people may jib and may offer obvious objections. Because we don't conventionally call the United States and China as they are today, empires would say that China's, by definition, has been a post-imperial power since 1911. It's a very long time since China made any significant territorial acquisitions. Really, you have to go back, I suppose, to Xinjiang in the 18th century, unless you count Tibet, which is an arguable case because its historical links with China are very exceptionally profound. And in the case of the United States, it also, has been like China, an explicitly self-proclaimedly anti-imperial power, at least since the time of Woodrow Wilson, the early days of the American Republic. People were very happy to speak of an empire of liberty or a republican empire. But it's a long time, not really since the acquisition of the Danish Virgin Islands by purchase in 1917, the United States has made any territorial acquisitions. It's actually surrendered much more territory than it's acquired. And although it behaves in a rather bullying manner at the moment, it behaves imperiously, if not imperially. We still tend to think that, you can be either a republic or an empire, but not both. However, that's not really the case, because, if you look back over history, there have been a lot of republican empires, as ancient Rome, in ancient Athens. In the Middle Ages, there was the Phoenician and Genoese empires. In the early modern period, there was the Netherlandish and Cromwellian empires. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the French Republic was also the heartland of one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. So in principle, it doesn't seem to me to be irrational to consider republics in the same category as empires. And in any case, when you think of China, stupendous continuities of Chinese history as such, that it's not illegitimate to suggest that we can look for political continuities that span the 20th century and the long period of explicitly imperial China that preceded it. And in suggesting that one might be able to do this, I'm not really doing anything new. A lot of people have characterized the People's Republic as a quasi-imperial state in many ways. Famous book by Dick Wilson about Mao was called The People's Emperor. So for all those reasons, I think this is in principle a legitimate approach. And if you don't like it, if you reject these arguments, I hope you'll be willing to think of it at least as a sort of thought experiment. To say, if, for the sake of argument, we look at the history of the United States and the history of China as if these states were imperial states, were still imperial states, what would be the consequences? Would it yield for us any new insights? And if so, I would argue that that would in itself justify the experiment. And finally, I have to insist in explaining why I'm taking this approach, that for me, the term empire is not pejorative. We tend to treat it as a sort of dirty word nowadays. Now, it became a dirty word in US discourse really at the time of American involvement in the First World War, and it's never ceased to have those pejorative connotations in the United States. Indeed, they were considerably increased by Ronald Reagan, who used imperial rhetoric to denounce the Soviet Union, calling it the evil empire. And in a world of post-colonialism and decolonization, it's very hard nowadays, to find somebody with a good word to say about empires. But in my submission, if you just look at the states that we've conventionally called empires, I know I haven't yet said what I actually mean by an empire, I'll come to that in a moment. But if you look historically at the states that we've conventionally called by this term, it seems to me that on balance, they're just like other states, and indeed like other groups of any sort, other individuals. They're mixtures of virtues and vices, in which, sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're good for some people and other times bad for others, and so on. But it's very difficult, I think, to argue that overall they're not like all other states, that they're morally neutral, or at least morally equivocal, as they alternate between doing good and doing evil. And if you say, for example, that they're typically oppressive states, I think that's true, but they can also be liberating. If you only have to think, for example, of the Spanish monarchy liberating from the much worse tyranny of the Aztecs and Incas, hundreds of subject and victim communities that had been blighted and terrorized under their former masters. Or you only have to think of the role of the British Empire in liberating slaves. You might say that empires are burdensome states that tend to exact very heavy taxation and tribute. And again, I absolutely agree with you. I'd say that's typically very often the case. But empires can also be very enriching to their subject and victim peoples by creating new arenas of commerce and economic activity, by promoting long-range trade, by introducing very often to subject and victim peoples new forms of economic activity. In some ways, I think one of the reasons why China has been such a successful and enduring state by comparison with most others, if you go back, I don't know when you think China begins, Cambridge history of China begins with the Qin invasion, if I remember rightly, but in many ways, the continuities of China's history embrace a much longer period, going back to the second millennium BC, when two zones of contrasting economic and ecological natures fuse, the Yellow River Valley and the Yangtze Valley, which have different ecologies, different products, and therefore indemnify their inhabitants against blight and disaster. And pretty much, every large state, and empires, we'll come to this in a moment, but empires tend to be relatively large states, have this property of providing enhanced economic opportunities for the people who live in them. Or you may say, that empires are very violent states. They often terrorize and inflict dreadful punishments on their victim peoples. And again, I'd have to say to you, it's true, but at the same time, they can also be peaceful, peace-bringing states like the Pax Romana or the Pax Mongolica or the Pax Britannica or the Song dynasty in China, which I think also benefited people outside its borders by being, on the whole, a peaceful regime. Or you may say that empires are culturally very destructive. And again, I'd have to say to you, it's true. They often eliminate cultures by, I don't know, sort of massacre and by the imposition of alien cultures on subject peoples. But they can also be very creative culturally. And I'll just, cite one example, which is often overlooked by people who are uniformly critical and unappreciative of the beneficence of some empires. And that example is the proliferation of new languages that characterized early modern empires, which gave rise to literally scores, perhaps hundreds of new languages, some of which nowadays are the national languages of significant communities like Sranan in Suriname or Papiamento in Curacao or Papuan in New Guinea. And indeed, just as empires can be very productive economically for their subject and victim peoples, they can also be very stimulating creatively, intellectually, artistically, because they promote the exchange of ideas in wider spheres across bigger arenas than might otherwise have been the case. And there's nothing in my submission so good for the world as the exchange of ideas. That's always been the way in which we've enriched our thinking and made intellectual and artistic progress. So I make no apologies for being a student of empires, because I think they do good as well as harm, just like all other states. And of course, they are extremely important, because we can't understand history without understanding the political and institutional frameworks which have been so dominant for so much of the past. So, if I'm allowed, therefore, in principle, to take this approach and to try and consider the histories of the United States and of China in the context of those of states that we commonly call empires, I can't any longer postpone, I suppose, saying what I think an empire is. Now, this is a much harder subject than one might suppose. A few years ago, in fact, rather a long time ago, it's about 20 years ago now, I was having dinner in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with David Armitage, a great expert on the history of the British Empire, author of the intellectual origins of the British Empire, with Leonard Busset, who I think is quite well known in China, as a great expert on the Dutch Empire, with the late Chris Bailey, who wrote a wonderful book about the Raj, and with Shruti Kapila, who in those days was a young colleague of mine, but she was already teaching a course on the comparative study of empires, and of course she is now a grandee in the University of Cambridge. So there we were around the table, five people, including, all experts supposedly on the history of empire, including four people who are, reputedly amongst the biggest experts on the subject in the world. And as you can imagine, ladies and gentlemen, we had a lot of disagreements around that table. But one thing that we agreed about was that none of us could say what an empire was. That's really a rather shocking thought, isn't it? That, we were supposedly great experts, and we literally did not know what we were talking about because we could not come up with a satisfactory definition of empires. And many historians and political scientists have ventured such definitions, but none of them is really satisfactory because no definition of empire that I've ever seen is so formulated as to cover all the states that we commonly call empires and also to exclude all others. I'm just looking for the next image. When I don't know how to define something, I fall back on this. Or is it a duck? Or is it a canard? Obviously, when you look at this image, you realize that I am alluding to a famous painting by René Magritte, a painting of a pipe bearing a caption, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." But I'm also alluding to a famous anecdote, famous joke, really, in the United States, which is told about different people, but I like the version in which the protagonist is Senator McCarthy, the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee in the early 50s, who persecuted communists. And the story goes that a journalist asked him, "How do you know who's a communist?" And he is supposed to have replied, "If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck." In other words, when you can't define something, you instead, what you try to do is you profile it. You try to select the characteristics that most frequently apply when the term that you're trying to define is invoked. And so if we try to do with empires what McCarthy tried to do with ducks or communists, what do we find? And I suppose most people would say that typically empires are conquest states. But almost every state is, in a sense, a conquest state, because every state, with the exception of the Holy See and a few other very, small micro-states, almost every state occupies at least some of its territory because it acquired it from somebody else. And you might say, well, it tends to be a large state, and that's also true, although some empires can be very small. The first state that typically, regarded as an empire in the history of the world was Sargons in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC, which was a very small state, the size of Wales. But I suppose it's fair to say that empires are conquest states, and they are large, at least in relation to the states that precede and succeed them in the areas they occupy. And you might say that, another feature of the common profile of an empire is that it's a culturally plural state in which perhaps people of one description tend to have more power than people of another. But again, that's the normal way in which political life is led. There are very, very few states that aren't culturally plural. And there are some states that we call empires which are very culturally homogeneous. I mean, Japan is a striking case until the conquest of the Ainu, which didn't happen until the 17th century. Japan was an ethnically very homogeneous state, but it hasn't stopped us calling it an empire. And even today, Japan is still, pretty homogeneous. The minorities it has are very small, and mostly they're a fairly recent immigration. And you might say that an empire is typically a state in which the elite think they have something to offer to subject and victim peoples and perhaps to the whole world. This was a feature of empires which my old friend and former boss John Eliot always used to insist upon. And I think that also tends to be true, but it's clearly not true of all the states we call empires. And it is true of quite a lot of the states that we don't. I mean, especially the United States, which is in which the elite at least profess, to want to bring democracy or what the American version of representative democracy to the world. And indeed China, for most of the history of China, Chinese elite thought that they had the mandate of heaven, or more recently, the mandate of Mao to offer to the world. So there are all these features of empires, but none of them, they all form part of the profile of a typical empire, but none of them is a defining feature. And I suppose perhaps the last thing that most people would mention is they'd say, well, empires tend to be very powerful states. And this, I think, is where people make their really big mistake, because empires are not typically powerful states. On the contrary, in my submission, empires are typically very weak. They may lay heavy hands on their heartlands, but they stretch feeble fingertips towards their peripheries. Now, I don't have time to explain this in detail now because I see I'm already coming pretty close to the end of the time I'm allowed. But I'll just show you, by way of example, this feature of the Spanish Empire. This is the ruins of a fortress that the Spanish monarchy maintained on the shores of what is now Iran. In the late 16th century, it was one of a series of 7 forts which are almost forgotten. I mean, this is really a forgotten corner of the imperial history of the world. And in the 1580s, the commander of this fort wrote to the King of Spain, explaining all the problems he had in maintaining this fort. It wasn't actually this one, because this is the only one that of which anything survives. The rest are just humps in the ground. And he explained that he had to rebuild his fort every year after the rains, and how he only had a garrison of 40 native recruits and 7 Portuguese, and these weren't enough for all the things he had to do, like defending the fort and escorting merchants and fighting off the bandits, and how he didn't have enough munitions, by which he didn't mean gunpowder. They didn't even have any firearms, even arrows. But the real sort of killer line in this petition to the king comes right at the end, when he says, and I don't know whether your majesty is aware of this, but what my really big problem is that I don't have enough opium to keep my men supplied. In other words, they were faced with a task so impossible that they couldn't cope with it unless they were spaced out of their minds. And that's what I mean when I say that typically empires are very weak, especially at their peripheries, and obviously especially if they're pre-industrial empires, because they also have huge problems of communications. But I think this is a feature of empires that transcends the Industrial Revolution, and that you can only succeed as an empire if you recruit enough collaborators or quislings, if you satisfy enough indigenous elites to ensure their allegiance and to preserve it for long periods of time. And obviously the Romans did this amongst many other strategies by extending Roman citizenship to all their subject peoples from the mid-3rd century onwards. The Spanish were very successful in recruiting indigenous elites, mainly by providing them with a great many economic opportunities, with legal systems that they were able to exploit, and with tremendous investment in infrastructure, which tended to enrich at least indigenous elites, if not most ordinary people. Um, and if you want to identify, the successful, long-lived empires which outlasted their rivals in antiquity and the Middle Ages and the modern period, this is what distinguishes them. It's the ability to secure the allegiance of subject and victim peoples, or at least of those peoples' elites. And it's in this respect, I think you can see from the way I've profiled empires that in many ways the United States and China share a lot of the typical profile of imperial states. But what distinguishes them, in my opinion, is their unrivaled, unparalleled, unprecedented success in recruiting their subjects to their cause. In the United States, it doesn't matter whether you're a Black American or a Native American or an Italian or Polish or German or Italian American. You're an American and you've bought in to this overarching identity and you've bought into allegiance to the imperial or quasi-imperial state. And to a great extent, although China has obviously some difficulties with its Muslim minority in the extreme west of the country, and perhaps to some extent with Hong Kong. And the same is also true of China. It doesn't matter whether you're a Hakka or a Min or a Wu or a Li or I don't know, a Bai or a Can or a Dong, whatever we're going to call them, or a Miao. You think of yourself as Chinese. And it's the long-term success of these two states in recruiting their minorities to share in the pride and patriotism of a collective allegiance that distinguishes them from the other states that that are the collapsed and failed empires of the world. And indeed, it's because they haven't been successful in recruiting this kind of allegiance that other empires have failed. Here we see a terrible case, a typical case in some ways of failure. These are victims of the Indian famine of 1875. Obviously, being unable to keep your people alive is one of the severest forms of failure. This is a scene in Darfur. Very often empires are at their most abject when they're withdrawn. They demonstrate their failure by leaving chaos and death in their wake. Sometimes they're moral failures. This is a little Chechen boy learning to hate Russians during the recent Chechen war. But the failure, of course, usually takes the form of collapse, and it's sometimes allied to external war, but in my submission, it's always allied to failure or limitations in securing internal allegiance. So China and the United States have this critical similarity. They've been uniquely successful in this respect. And one wonders, what the future will bring. I don't think either of these states is secure in its hold on the allegiance of its own people indefinitely. I think there are more signs, more potential for erosion in the case of China than there are in the case of the United States, but neither state is guaranteed long-term survival in this respect. But the biggest threat to the long-term endurance of both of these states comes not, I think, from internal dissension, so much as from the danger of external war, and above all of war with each other. And one of the things that has most shocked me about the recent life I've led in the United States is the ubiquity with which people in the establishment and the Foreign Service, the State Department, the military regard China as an inevitable enemy. And I suspect that, there's quite a lot of similar reverse feeling in China. And the two countries do face each other across the Pacific. They do have obvious conflicts of interest. But to nourish mutual enmity, especially at a time when the peace of the world is threatened more by Mr. Putin probably than by anybody else, and more by Russia than by any other country. It's crazy, I think, for either of these countries to focus its enmity on the other. The United States, in my opinion, is making the same mistake now as she made in the 1920s and 1930s, when she threw all her potential enemies, Russia, Japan, and Germany, into each other's arms. And she's doing the same now by simultaneously alienating Russia, China, the Islamic world, and even, it seems now, India. I think if China and the United States are going to emulate the success of successful states that we've called empires in the past, the most important item on their agenda is and ought to be peace. Of states, I don't think they either evolve nor do they live. They don't have bodies politic except in a very metaphorical sense. And obviously all empires so far have come to an end, but they've come to an end, in lots of different ways and for many different reasons, and some of them have been very short-lived. The long-lived ones. You take the Roman Empire in antiquity or the Spanish Empire in the early modern period. By comparison with other empires of those periods, these are really startlingly successful examples of longevity, if I'm allowed a biological metaphor. People forget the Spanish Empire outlives other European empires in continental North America by a very long way. The British, the French, they've gone really from continental North America, with the exception of Canada, long before the Spaniards are gone. And I think that longevity, like the ancient Roman longevity, is attributable to the influence I've mentioned, the ability of the metropolitan elites to secure the allegiance of a critical mass of quislings, collaborators, indigenous elites that become invested in the empire and regard themselves as part of it and are happy to cooperate with it. And I think that's also why China and the United States have so far been very successful states. And if you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you look at states that alienate their subject and victim peoples, well, I suppose the most startling example of all is the Nazi Empire, which, whilst it lasted, was very big, but the Nazis were extremely bad at securing their subject people's allegiance. They thought, that they could tyrannize and bully people into submission. You can't do that. You can only secure the allegiance of subject and victim peoples in empires, just as you can only secure the allegiance of minorities in other smaller states. If you reward them, if you satisfy them, if you give them something that makes it worth their while remaining loyal to elites with whom they typically have very little in common. So, Alan, the short answer is no.
And do you think in the two empires, or let's say three, Russia Empire and China and America can coexist for long?
Yes, of course they can. I mean, the classic example, I suppose, would be the Roman and Persian empires, who were always, regarded themselves as mutual enemies. The Romans always characterized the Persians as enemies. Persians are common subject of Roman nightmares. Persians always regarded the Romans as enemies, but they became like, I don't know, the sort of two ends of a dumbbell. They came almost, to depend on each other. And they both fell in a way simultaneously to the Arab invasions of the seventh and early eighth century, early eighth centuries. Um, so, of course, empires can coexist, and indeed they can nourish one another. If you eliminate your rivals, it's usually a very bad strategy because then your own subject and victim peoples have lost a reason to maintain their allegiance to you, because very often, you'll stick with one bunch of rulers, even if you're dissatisfied with them, in order to avoid conquest by another whom you regard with even greater fear and loathing. Great example of that again in the Spanish Empire would be with indigenous people in the 18th century who, in conflicts on the borders between the British and the Spanish, always aligned with the Spaniards because they knew that whatever the deficiencies of the Spaniards, the British would treat them worse. So so of course you can always coexist with an enemy, and in many ways, it's often essential to have an enemy in order to focus the allegiance of your own people. Um, the danger, it seems to me, is always that in a three empire or four empire or five empire situation, which is pretty much what we're heading for at the moment. We're in a world in which we're going to have, at some point in the reasonably near future, we're going to have sort of equipolency between Russia, the United States, China, India, and probably, some kind of Islamic confederation or state. And the danger is that uh, three or four of them will gang up on one of the others, and that's the future that it seems to me the United States is actively provoking, actively inviting at the moment by making enemies everywhere, when the rational thing is to avoid having more than one enemy at a time. And again, I come back to my point. They did this in the 1920s and 1930s. It was, in my opinion, the height of folly to alienate Japan at the same time as the United States had really irretrievably bad relations with Germany and Russia. The reasons why they alienated Japan in the 20s and 30s are very similar to the reasons why they seem unable to get on with China nowadays. It's Pacific rivalry. And it's oil. I mean, these things are still at the heart of the difficulties that these two countries are having today, just as they were the heart of the difficulties the United States and Japan had with each other before the Second World War. And look at the consequences of driving the Japanese into the arms of the Germans and driving the Russians and the Germans to come to an agreement with each other. The consequence was, to put it very crudely, the Second World War. And it baffles and staggers me that the US establishment doesn't seem to be aware of that and seems to be making the same mistake now.
It is very frightening. I'm just going to ask Dominic whether he had a question, because before he close.
Here I am, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can very clearly.
Oh, that's amazing.
You have your question.
Well, it's a sort of question comment, really. Look, thank you very much for the talk. I agreed with overwhelming majority of it, and certainly with your contemporary sort of commitments, 2000%. I totally agree with the idea that it's a fool's game to begin having arguments about whether X or Y country is or isn't an empire, especially when there are contemporary ideological elements involved. The great thing to ask is whether thinking of a country as an empire teaches or tells you interesting things you wouldn't otherwise, understand about it. I came to this subject via the Soviet Union, so that was absolutely crucial. Asking whether it was an empire just ended up with a sort of ideological bun fight. The one thing I didn't agree with you, at least not entirely, was this question of power. For me, power has always been one of the three key ingredients of empire. And of course, I mean soft power, ideological, cultural power, at least as much as hard power. Well, the thing about empires is that they could generate and accumulate enormous resources. But of course, you're totally right. And this was the great dilemma of pre-modern empire, that they were simultaneously very powerful and very weak, for the simple reason that trying to rule vast areas with pre-modern communications was a constant nightmare. It seems to me that really, once one's dealing with the second half of the 19th century and certainly the 20th century and now, the name of the game is somehow to combine the power that empire gives in international relations, the resources, the continental scale. But you've also got to somehow have legitimacy in an era of mass literacy, increasing ideas about democratization, big government. We are you can no longer have light touch, as virtually all pre-modern empires were light touch government. That doesn't work nowadays. So, you've got a real dilemma. And it seems to me that, the one thing that unites the Chinese and the United States is that they've done to a significant degree what most of the rulers of great empires at the end of the 19th century dreamed of doing, which was to maintain an empire, but to turn as much as possible of it into what we might describe as a nation, to some extent homogeneous community in which the mass of the population felt a commitment both to fellow citizens or fellow co-ethnics. You always had to have both, but also a sense of commitment to the polity, to the elites, etc. China's done it. It's the greatest of all imperial traditions, but partly, well, to a great extent, demographic reasons, but also cultural power. It has turned 95% of the population into what you might describe as a nation. And in a different process, the United States was an attempt to do the same. And both of them have problems about trying to preserve the solidarity and the legitimacy of the community in order to provide the state with the essential, commitment of its citizens. So that seems to me to be the name of the game when one's talking about the United States and China. And I absolutely agree that they damn well better learn to live together on one planet, because if not, they're likely to take the rest of us down with them.
Yes, thank you, Dominic. I'll just take the last of your points because it does suggest something extra that I could add. I don't want to quarrel with you about anything that you've said. Obviously, I was using the word power in a particular sense when I spoke of the weakness of empires and my rejection of the notion that they're powerful. I was thinking of physical power, and obviously on the technological question, in many ways, I think the remarkable thing is how little difference it makes to the potential durability of empires to have enormous technological resources. Of course, it's much harder to maintain a large pre-industrial than a large post-industrial state, but in many ways, having all this technology at one's disposal encourages elites to do things that are really beyond their scope, even with all the equipment at their disposal. But those are just very minor glosses on what you've said, which I broadly agree with. But your last point does suggest something else to me that I ought probably to have mentioned in the talk if I'd had time, but which I'll take the opportunity to mention now, which is you've got to ask, why is it that the United States and China have been so successful in a way that most of the states that we conventionally call empires have not, or haven't for, to the same extent? How they recruited all of these minorities and subject and victim communities into what you call a nation. I mean, I think I prefer to call it a polity. But it is true that they've got this in common, and it seems to me to be one of the great features that people ought to take more notice of. So you've got to ask, how did they do it? And I think obviously in the case of the United States had a great advantage in that most of these communities, with the exception of Native Americans and Black Americans, most of these communities are the descendants of people who came to the United States voluntarily and did so because they wanted to renounce the allegiance that they left behind on the other side of the ocean. And the United States has made it possible for them to retain a sense of distinctive identity, and Italian Americans and German Americans and Polish Americans, they all have their distinctive customs and their distinctive clubs and associations and festival days and marches and foods and so on. And yet, at the same time, they've brought in pretty much without exception to the notion of America as their home, and all the myths of America, the American dream, the uniqueness of America, and all of these things are very strongly felt. And I think that's partly because of the historic trajectory of their forebears in renouncing their original allegiances. In the case of China, I mean, I think China's been very remarkable in many ways in recruiting all these communities to allegiance to the state, whilst also, allowing them, a strong sense of their own cultural antecedents and past, in some cases, languages. But I think that one of the things that's typically overlooked by historians of China is the extent to which this investment in China, the sense of oneself as Chinese, even if one's a Hakka or Miao or whatever, has been forged abroad. And I mentioned Leonard Boussay in my talk, and I was very impressed a few years ago by an article of his that I read about Chinese workers in Borneo in the 18th century. Well, when they went to Borneo, they didn't know they were Chinese. It was because the Dutch told them they were Chinese. And Leonard Boussay cites all these letters which they wrote home saying to people, saying to their relations, "Did you know we're Chinese?" And I'm not suggesting this is more than a sort of marginal contribution to the forging of Chinese identity amongst minorities in the country, but I think it's an important aspect that's possibly been overlooked and ought to deserve a bigger role in historians' accounts.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for your talk.
Well, I think that together you've exhausted our questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, dear, well, what a terrible,
and also for you,
terrible failure
for a wonderful discursive talk about empire.
Well, it's very kind of you. I'm very sorry that I didn't provoke the disagreement that I was hoping for. As I say, I think it's the foundation of all progress. So long live disagreement, as long as it doesn't disturb peace. Many thanks for having me, and all success to the Royal Asiatic Society of Beijing in the future.
Well, I hope one day you'll be able to come to China and we'll be able to entertain you here.
Well, that would be lovely.
Meanwhile, before I close the event, may I just mention what we've got coming up? On Sunday, there's a trip to Boussier's Garden, which is sold out, and I think the waiting list is so long that that also is really full. And then on Saturday, 21st, we have our AGM and the dinner following it. The dinner following it is going to be at this sensational place, the Sensory Garden at T Mao. And the talk will be by the global influencer Hong Huang, and she's going to be talking about China maxing. And we very much hope that everyone coming will take the opportunity to do a bit of China maxing themselves, at least in their dress. We've got some places left. If you can sign up by the end of this week, that would be very good. And then on Sunday the 29th, Books and Bubbles, a group are going to be discussing the book The Wedding Party, about life in 1980s Beijing. It sounds a very entertaining book. I urge people to buy it on Kindle and read it if they want to join in the event. We've then got a full program, almost one event every week in April and May. So those of you who are not yet members of RASBJ, seriously consider joining. And everybody else, thank you very much for coming this evening, and look forward to seeing you at our AGM and dinner on the 21st. Thank you all very much indeed. I'll close the meeting now.
Alan, before I leave you, it's just I noticed that there are various questions in chat, so just please let members of the audience know that they can email me questions that I haven't dealt with during the meeting.